1. The country at the end of the world. If you were an American in the early 1800s and you looked at a world map, Japan was not a country you thought about much. It wasn't like China, which Americans already saw as a giant civilization full of tea, silk, and trade. Japan was something stranger, a rumor, a silhouette, a set of islands floating off the edge of Asia like a locked treasure chest. And the truth was, Japan wanted it that way. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had been living under a policy that, if you were writing the story like an American newspaper man, might sound like the most extreme form of national isolation ever attempted. Japan was closed. Not closed in the sense of not very friendly, closed in the sense of foreigners were basically banned. Japanese people were not allowed to leave. Christianity was outlawed. Trade was tightly controlled. The government treated outside influence like poison. In the United States, where the national identity was tied to expansion, immigration, and movement, the idea of a country deliberately sealing itself off was almost impossible to understand. But in Japan, the people running the show believed it was the only way to survive. To understand why, you have to step back into the Japan that existed before the United States was even born. 2. Japan's old order, a world built like a fortress. Japan's old political system was not a democracy, not even close. It was a hierarchy built like a stone castle. At the top was the emperor. But here's the twist. For most of Japanese history, the emperor wasn't really the person who made the big decisions. The emperor was sacred, almost like a living symbol of the nation's soul, but real political power belonged to someone else. That someone was the shogun ***. The shogun was the military ruler. Think of him as the commander-in-chief, except he also controlled the entire government, the economy, and the social structure. Under the shogun were the **daimyo**, the great regional lords who controlled large domains. Each daimyo had their own armies, their own taxes, and their own castles. And under them were the samurai the warrior class, trained from youth to fight, to obey, and to die with honor if necessary. Then came the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. It was a society where you didn't become something through ambition. You were born into a slot and you stayed there. And if you were a samurai, you were not just a soldier. You were a symbol of discipline and loyalty. Your life was shaped by the code called Bushido ***, the way of the warrior. Bushido wasn't just about violence. It was about self-control, about respect, about honor. But it also created a society where violence was always close, always possible, always part of the political landscape. Japan had lived through brutal civil wars for centuries. The country had been fractured, with warlords battling for dominance. Eventually, one family won the contest. That family was the Tokugawa **3 the Tokugawa shogunate, peace through control. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu defeated his rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara, one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. After that, Japan entered a new era. The Tokugawa shogunate would rule for over 250 years. And they did it with a system that was both brilliant and paranoid. They believed peace could only be maintained if the daimyo were kept under constant surveillance. So they created a policy called **Sankinkatai**, which forced daimyo to spend every other year in Edo, modern Tokyo, while their families remained there permanently as a kind of hostage. Imagine telling every powerful governor in the United States, "You can run your state, but your wife and children must live in Washington, D.C. under federal watch." That's the level of control we're talking about. The daimyo were allowed to keep their domains, but they were drained financially by the cost of traveling and maintaining residences in Edo. This weakened them. It prevented rebellion. It kept the shogunate in charge. The result was something Japan had rarely experienced before: long-term peace. The Tokugawa era became a time of cultural growth. Cities expanded, literacy rose, theater, poetry, and art flourished. Japan developed a strong identity, deeply rooted in tradition. And then came the foreign threat. #4 Why Japan shut the door. Japan's isolation policy is often described as a kind of stubbornness or arrogance. But that's not really fair. Japan had reasons. In the 1500s, Europeans arrived, Portuguese traders, then Spanish and Dutch. With them came firearms, new goods, and new ideas. But they also brought something else: Christian missionaries. Christianity spread quickly in parts of Japan. Some daimyo converted, partly out of belief and partly for trade advantages. To the Tokugawa rulers, this looked like the beginning of the end. They had seen what happened in other parts of the world. They saw European empires expanding, conquering, colonizing. They watched Spain take the Philippines. They watched Portugal carve out trading empires. They saw the pattern. 1. Missionaries arrive. 2. Converts multiply. 3. European political influence grows. 4. Military conquest follows. To the Tokugawa, Christianity was not just a religion. It was a Trojan horse. So they banned it. They hunted converts. They executed priests. They crushed rebellions like the Shimabara uprising in 1637, where Christian peasants and Ronin, masterless samurai, rose against the government. After that, Japan tightened the lock. Only the Dutch were allowed limited trade, and even then, only through a tiny artificial island called *Dejima, in Nagasaki. Japan was not completely blind to the world, but it watched from behind a wall. For 2 centuries, it worked. Then the 1800s arrived, and the world outside Japan changed dramatically. #5 The New World knocks: steam, guns, and empire. By the time America was expanding westward, by the time it fought the War of 1812, by the time it annexed Texas, by the time it seized California, Europe and the United States were undergoing a technological revolution. Steam power, modern artillery, industrial production, naval fleets built of iron and powered by engines. The gap between Japan and the West began to widen. Japan's samurai were brave, disciplined, and deadly in the old style of war. But the West was building a new kind of war. And the West was hungry. The 1800s were the golden age of imperialism. Britain had India. France pushed into Southeast Asia. Russia expanded toward the Pacific. The United States, after pushing across the continent, was now looking outward. And there was one practical reason Americans started looking toward Japan: the ocean. #6 America's Pacific problem: whales, ships, and survival. In the early 1800s, the United States had become a major whaling nation. Whaling ships went deep into the Pacific. They hunted whales for oil, used for lamps, lubrication, and industry. But whaling was dangerous. Ships were wrecked by storms, sailors got sick, crews ran out of food and water. They needed ports. They needed safe harbors. They needed places to repair ships. And the Pacific was enormous. Japan was perfectly positioned, like a stepping stone between the American West Coast and China. To American merchants and naval planners, Japan wasn't just a mysterious island kingdom. It was a strategic necessity. But Japan refused. American ships that approached Japanese shores were often warned away or fired upon. Sailors who washed up were sometimes imprisoned. Japan's message was clear: Go away. To Americans, especially Americans used to pushing boundaries, that was unacceptable. And eventually, the United States decided it would not ask politely anymore. #7 Enter Commodore Perry, the man who would not take no. In 1853, an American naval officer named Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with a squadron of warships. These were not normal ships. They were steam-powered. They belched black smoke. They carried heavy guns. The Japanese called them the Black Ships, and they were terrifying. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was a message. Perry brought a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore demanding Japan open relations with the United States. He made it clear that America wanted safe harbor for American ships, protection for shipwrecked sailors, trade agreements, diplomatic relations. But Perry did something that broke Japanese protocol completely. He refused to deal with low-level officials. He demanded to deliver the letter to someone of high authority. He acted like a man who knew Japan was not ready for what America could do. The Japanese government panicked, because for 250 years, their system had been designed to keep foreign threats outside the gate. Now the threat was inside the bay. #8 Japan's crisis, a government built for yesterday. The Tokugawa shogunate faced an impossible situation. If they resisted, they risked war. And war with the West in the 1850s was not like war in the 1600s. Japan's coastal defenses were outdated. Its cannons were old. Its ships were mostly wooden sailing vessels. It did not have a modern navy. If America attacked, Japan could lose quickly. But if the shogunate gave in, it would look weak. And weakness could shatter the entire political system. Many samurai believed the shogunate had lost its legitimacy the moment it allowed foreigners to dictate terms. This was not just diplomacy. This was a crack in the foundation of Japan's world. Perry left, promising to return. And Japan knew he meant it. #9 The Treaty of Kanagawa, Japan forced open. In 1854, Perry returned with an even larger fleet. Japan, under intense pressure, signed the Treaty of Kanagawa ***. This treaty opened 2 ports to American ships. It guaranteed humane treatment for shipwrecked sailors. It allowed a U.S. consul in Japan. It was not a full trade treaty yet, but it was the beginning. And once the door was open, it could not be closed again. Other Western nations rushed in. Britain, Russia, France, the Netherlands. They demanded similar treaties. And soon Japan was trapped in a pattern that had already happened to China. Unequal treaties. These agreements gave Western nations trade privileges and legal protections that Japan did not get in return. Foreigners could often avoid Japanese law. Tariffs were controlled. Japan's sovereignty was undermined. To the Japanese, this was humiliating. To Americans, it was business. But the consequences inside Japan were explosive. #10 Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians. Japan's internal political conflict now erupted. A movement grew among samurai and scholars. Sano Joy **, revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians. They believed the shogunate had failed. They believed Japan needed to return power to the emperor and resist foreign influence. But here's the thing. Even the people who wanted to expel foreigners knew Japan couldn't fight them with old weapons. Some radicals attacked foreigners. Some assassinated officials. Violence spread. Japan entered a period of chaos. The Tokugawa government was crumbling. And at the center of it all was a question that would define Japan for the next century. How do you survive in a world dominated by industrial empires? Do you isolate? Do you resist? Do you modernize? Do you imitate the West? Or do you become the West? Japan's answer would shock the world. #11 The Meiji Restoration. The samurai era ends. By the late 1860s, the Tokugawa shogunate was collapsing. Two powerful domains, Satsuma and Choshu, formed an alliance to overthrow it. They claimed to act in the name of the emperor. In 1868, the shogunate fell. Power was restored, at least officially, to the emperor. This event is known as the Meiji Restoration, and it was one of the most dramatic political transformations in modern history. Japan, a feudal society ruled by samurai and hereditary lords, began transforming itself into a centralized modern nation-state. The new leaders were young. They were ambitious. They were ruthless. They believed Japan had only one choice: modernize fast or be conquered. #12 Japan learns from America and everyone else. The Meiji government sent delegations around the world to study Western systems. They studied American industrial production, European military organization, British naval power, German bureaucracy, French legal systems. They wanted to absorb the best of the West. But unlike many countries forced into modernization by colonizers, Japan was trying to do it on its own terms. They built railroads. They built factories. They modernized the army. They created a national education system. They centralized taxation. They created a constitution. They turned the emperor into a national symbol of unity, almost like a living flag. And they dismantled the samurai class. This was not a gentle process. Many samurai lost their status, their income, and their identity. Some adapted. Some became bureaucrats. Some became business leaders. Others rebelled. The most famous rebellion was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, often called the Last Samurai. It was crushed, and with it, the age of the samurai truly ended. Japan was becoming something new, and America was watching. #13 America's View: Curiosity, Admiration, and Fear. In the United States, Japan's transformation was viewed with a mix of fascination and unease. On one hand, Americans admired Japan's speed. It was like watching a country leap across centuries in a single generation. On the other hand, Americans were used to thinking of Asian nations as weak compared to Western powers. Japan challenged that assumption. And Japan was not modernizing just to survive. It was modernizing to compete. #14 The Road Ahead: Japan becomes an empire. By the end of the 1800s, Japan's modernization had produced something powerful. A modern army, a modern navy, an industrial base, a national identity built around loyalty and discipline. Japan began looking outward. And in a world where empires were the standard, Japan did what empires did. It expanded. It fought wars. It took territory. Japan's first major test came against China, then against Russia. And when Japan defeated Russia in 1905, the world was stunned. For the first time in the modern era, an Asian nation had defeated a major European power. The balance of global power shifted, and America's relationship with Japan would never be the same. The moment Japan stopped being a mystery and started being a problem. By the late 1800s, Japan was no longer a closed world of samurai and wooden castles. Japan was modern. Not sort of modern. Modern in the way that mattered to imperial powers: steel, factories, railroads, modern rifles, warships, and a government that could mobilize the whole nation. To Americans watching from across the Pacific, Japan's rise was fascinating. It was also unsettling, because the United States was in the middle of its own transformation. America had just finished its violent push west. It had built railroads that stitched together the continent. It had swallowed enormous territories. It had industrialized fast. The United States was becoming an empire too, though Americans rarely used that word. And now, across the Pacific, Japan was doing something similar. For decades, Westerners had assumed Asia would be dominated by Europe and America. Japan broke that assumption. And once a country breaks an assumption, people start asking a new question. What else can they do? #2 Japan's first big leap, the war with China. Japan's first test as a modern power came against China. To Americans, China was a massive civilization that seemed ancient and immovable. But in the 1800s, China was struggling badly. It had been battered by Western imperialism. It had lost wars. It had signed humiliating treaties. It was dealing with internal rebellions and corruption. Japan looked at China and saw two things. One, a civilization that had once dominated East Asia. Two, a weakened giant now vulnerable. And the prize at the center of the conflict was ** Korea. Korea was historically influenced by China, but Japan saw it as a dagger pointed at its own heart. If Korea fell under a hostile power, Japan believed it could be invaded. So Japan moved. In 1894, Japan went to war with China. This conflict is known as the ** First Sino-Japanese War **. It was short. It was decisive. And it shocked the world. Japan's modern army and navy destroyed Chinese forces. The old order of East Asia was collapsing. When the war ended in 1895, Japan forced China to sign the ** Treaty of Shimonoseki **. Japan gained Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, influence over Korea, a huge indemnity payment. To Americans, this was the first moment Japan looked like a real imperial power. But it wasn't the last. #3 The Western powers step in. You're not allowed to win that much. Here's something important about the imperial world of the 1800s. The West liked modernization in non-Western countries only when it stayed harmless. When a non-Western country modernized enough to win wars, claim territory, and challenge European interests, suddenly modernization wasn't so cute anymore. After Japan's victory, Russia, Germany, and France stepped in. They forced Japan to give back the Liaodong Peninsula, which included Port Arthur, an area Japan had won from China. This is known as the ** Triple Intervention **. It was humiliating. Japan had won the war fair and square. But the Western powers basically said, "Nice win, now give the prize back." In Japan, this was not forgotten. It created a burning sense of resentment. The message Japan absorbed was simple. The West will respect you only if it fears you. Japan had modernized to avoid becoming China. Now it saw that even winning wasn't enough. The West still treated Japan like a second-class power. So Japan did what ambitious countries do. It prepared for the next fight. #4 America enters the Pacific, the Spanish-American War. While Japan was expanding in Asia, the United States was stepping into the Pacific too. In 1898, the United States fought the ** Spanish-American War **. The war was short and lopsided. Spain was a fatting empire, and America's industrial strength gave it a huge advantage. The United States gained Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. And suddenly, America was no longer just a continental power. It was a Pacific power. This mattered because now the US and Japan had something in common. Both were rising empires, and rising empires tend to bump into each other. The Philippines became America's major foothold in Asia. Japan noticed. Japan also watched how the US treated the Philippines. America spoke the language of freedom and democracy. But in the Philippines, it fought a brutal war against Filipino independence fighters. Japan saw the contradiction. So did many Americans. But the key point is this. By 1900, the United States and Japan were moving into the same ocean. And the Pacific is not big enough for two expanding powers who both believe they deserve to lead. #5 The war that changed everything. Japan versus Russia. The next war Japan fought was against a European superpower. Russia. Russia had been expanding east for centuries. It wanted warm water ports. It wanted influence in Manchuria and Korea. Japan wanted the same region. And unlike China, Russia was not weak. Russia was a massive empire. In 1904, Japan attacked Russia at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. To Americans reading newspapers at the time, this war was almost like a sporting event. It had drama. It had underdogs. It had a sense of destiny. And it had something else. It was the first time in modern history that a non-European power was fighting a European empire as an equal. Japan fought hard. Japan's navy was disciplined and modern. Its soldiers were motivated. Its leaders were determined. Russia's forces were far from home. Supplies were difficult. Corruption and incompetence weakened their effort. In 1905, Japan destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at the *** Battle of Tsushima ***. It was one of the most decisive naval battles in modern history. The world was stunned. Japan had won. A European empire had been beaten. This was a psychological earthquake. #6 Theodore Roosevelt, the American president who helped Japan become a great power. Here, where the story becomes deeply American. The Russo-Japanese War ended not just with battlefield victories, but with diplomacy. The peace talks were held in the United States. The mediator was President Theodore Roosevelt ***. Roosevelt was fascinated by power. He believed nations were like people. Some were strong, some were weak, and the strong set the rules. Roosevelt also believed the United States had a role to play as a world power. He wanted stability in the Pacific. So he helped broker the *** Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Japan gained recognition of its influence over Korea, rights in Manchuria, control of Port Arthur, part of Sakhalin Island. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role. In America, Roosevelt looked like a peacemaker. In Japan, the treaty was complicated. Many Japanese citizens felt Japan deserved more, especially war reparations. They rioted in Tokyo. But the government accepted the treaty because Japan's economy was strained. Japan had won the war, but it had also bled for it. Still, one thing was clear. Japan had entered the ranks of the great powers, and America had helped make it official. #7 The annexation of Korea. Japan's empire turns permanent. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. This was not a temporary occupation. It was colonial rule. Japan governed Korea harshly. Koreans were suppressed politically. Their culture was controlled. Resistance was crushed. Japan justified this by claiming it was bringing modernization. It built railroads, schools, industry. but it did so in a way that benefited Japan. To Americans, Korea was far away and poorly understood. But Japan's annexation was a major sign of its direction. Japan wasn't modernizing to become a peaceful trading partner. Japan was modernizing to become a dominant empire. And empires are never satisfied. #8 The immigration issue, when Japan met America's racial wall. Now we get to one of the most important and most uncomfortable parts of the U.S.-Japan relationship. In the early 1900s, Japanese immigrants began arriving in the United States, especially on the West Coast. Many worked in agriculture. They were often hardworking, disciplined, and economically successful. This triggered a reaction. In California, white labor groups and politicians began pushing anti-Japanese sentiment. They said Japanese immigrants were unassimilable. They said they threatened wages. They said they threatened white society. But behind the arguments was something deeper. Racial prejudice. The U.S. in this era already had strong anti-Chinese laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had banned most Chinese immigration. Now Japanese immigrants became the new target. In 1906, the San Francisco School Board tried to segregate Japanese children into separate schools. Japan was furious, because Japan was no longer weak. Japan was a world power now, and it demanded respect. The conflict was serious enough that President Theodore Roosevelt intervened. Roosevelt didn't want war over school segregation. So the U.S. and Japan negotiated the *** Gentleman's Agreement * 1907-1908. Japan agreed to restrict emigration of laborers to the U.S. In exchange, the U.S. avoided formal exclusion laws and allowed Japanese families already in America to reunite. This reduced immigration, but it didn't solve the deeper problem. Japan saw American racism as humiliation. America saw Japanese pride as arrogance. The two nations were beginning to misread each other in dangerous ways. #9 The rise of Japanese American communities and the backlash. Japanese immigrants in America formed communities. They built businesses. They bought land. They farmed. They created churches and schools. And they raised children who were American citizens by birth. These American-born children were called ***. Their parents were ***. But in many states, Japanese immigrants could not become citizens because U.S. naturalization laws restricted citizenship to free white persons, and later to persons of African descent. Asian immigrants were excluded. This meant Japanese immigrants could live in America, work in America, pay taxes in America, but never fully belong. In California, laws were passed to stop Japanese immigrants from owning land. The **alien land laws targeted Asians by preventing aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning property. Japanese families found loopholes, often putting land in the names of their American-born children. This created even more resentment. The pattern was building. Japanese immigrants succeeded. White politicians reacted with restriction. Japan protested. America doubled down. It was a slow-burning conflict, rooted not just in diplomacy but in identity. #10 World War I. Japan joins the Allies and takes advantage. When World War I began in 1914, Japan joined the Allied side. This surprises some people today, because later Japan would become America's enemy. But in 1914, Japan saw an opportunity. Germany had colonies and naval bases in Asia and the Pacific. Japan attacked German holdings, including the port of Qingdao in China and islands in the Pacific. Japan expanded its influence. And because the Western powers were distracted by the European War, Japan had more freedom to act. Japan also issued the 21 demands to China in 1915, seeking greater control over Chinese politics and economy. This alarmed the United States. America had long supported the open-door policy in China, meaning no single empire should dominate Chinese markets. Japan's actions looked like a direct challenge. But America was not yet ready to confront Japan militarily. So the U.S. watched and waited. #11, the Washington Naval Conference. America tries to put a lid on Japan. After World War I ended, the U.S. emerged as the world's leading industrial power. Japan emerged as a major naval power. The Pacific now had multiple giants. And giants, if left unchecked, build bigger weapons. So the United States hosted the Washington Naval Conference in 1921-1922. The goal was to prevent an arms race. The major naval powers agreed to limit battleship construction. The treaty established a ratio for capital ships. United States 5, Britain 5, Japan 3, France 1.75, Italy 1.75. To Americans, this seemed reasonable. To Japanese leaders, it was insulting, because Japan believed it deserved equal status. Japan had fought Russia. It had modernized. It had joined World War I as an ally. And yet it was being told it could only have 60% of the battleships of the U.S. and Britain. That resentment mattered, because Japan's political culture was shifting. Moderates were losing influence. Nationalists were gaining ground. And the military was becoming more independent from civilian control. #12, the 1924 Immigration Act. America slams the door. In 1924, the United States passed the ** Immigration Act *, also called the Johnson-Reed Act. This law restricted immigration heavily. It set quotas favoring Northern and Western Europeans. And it did something especially significant. It banned immigration from Japan entirely. This was not a gentleman's agreement. This was formal exclusion. In Japan, it was seen as a national insult. Imagine if Japan passed a law saying, "No Americans are allowed to immigrate here because Americans are racially incompatible with Japan." That's how it felt. Even Japanese leaders who wanted friendly relations with the U.S. were weakened. Because how could they argue for cooperation with a country that openly rejected Japanese people? The U.S. had not just limited Japan's ships. It had rejected Japan's dignity. And dignity, especially in nationalist politics, is gasoline. #13, Japan's internal pressure. The empire needs fuel. Now we reach a key problem that drove Japan toward catastrophe. Japan was an island nation with limited natural resources. It needed oil, coal, iron, rubber, food supplies. As Japan industrialized, it became more dependent on imports. This made Japan vulnerable. Its leaders believed Japan needed control over territory and resources to survive. This was the logic of empire, and it became more powerful in Japan as the 1920s ended. Then came the Great Depression. #14, the Great Depression, when the world economy collapsed. The Great Depression began in 1929. It hit the United States hardest at first, but the shockwaves spread worldwide. Japan's economy was deeply connected to global trade. Japan exported silk and textiles. When demand collapsed, Japanese farmers and workers suffered. Economic pain fed political extremism. This was true in Germany. It was true in Italy. And it was true in Japan. Many Japanese people lost faith in civilian politicians. They blamed corruption. They blamed Western manipulation. They blamed the unequal treaties. They blamed the humiliation of immigration exclusion. They blamed the naval limits. They blamed everything. And the military offered a simple answer. Expand. Take resources. Secure markets. Build national strength. Restore honor. #15 The military takes the wheel, the road to Manchuria. In the early 1930s, the Japanese army in Manchuria, northeast China, acted almost like its own government. Officers believed Japan's future depended on controlling Manchuria. Manchuria had coal, iron, land, strategic depth. In 1931, Japanese officers staged an incident, the *Mukden incident ***, blaming Chinese forces for sabotage. It was essentially a false pretext. Japan used it to justify invading Manchuria. Japan seized the region and created a puppet state called *Manchukuo*. The League of Nations condemned Japan. Japan responded by leaving the League in 1933. This was a turning point. It showed Japan was willing to reject international opinion and pursue empire openly. America watched this with growing alarm. But America was still focused inward. The Great Depression had shattered confidence. Many Americans wanted isolation. They did not want another foreign conflict. So the U.S. protested diplomatically. But it did not act militarily. Japan interpreted this as weakness. And weakness invites expansion. #white heavy checkmark end of part 224. So by 1931, the situation looked like this. #America. Strong industrial power. Growing Pacific presence. Racist immigration restrictions. Wants trade and stability. Avoids war. #Japan. Modern military empire. Angry about Western disrespect. Needs resources. Military gaining power. Already expanding into China. The two nations were on a collision course. And the next decade would turn tension into fire. One Manchuria was not the end, it was the beginning. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, it wasn't just a land grab. It was a signal that Japan had crossed a line, from being a rising power trying to earn respect, to becoming an empire willing to use force whenever it wanted. To many Americans, the invasion felt distant. Manchuria was a strange word in a faraway place. It sounded like something you might read about on page 12 of the newspaper, under a headline squeezed between farm prices and baseball scores. But for people who understood global politics, Manchuria was a warning flare. Because it revealed a new Japan. A Japan where the military could act without permission. A Japan where civilian politicians could not restrain generals. A Japan where international treaties meant little. And a Japan that believed expansion was not just desirable, it was necessary for survival. In other words, Japan was moving toward a future where war wasn't a risk, it was a plan. #2 The military's logic. Japan must expand or suffocate. Japan's leaders were not idiots. They knew they were gambling. But they also believed they were trapped. Japan's industrial economy needed resources. Japan lacked oil, iron ore, rubber, large farmland, many key raw materials. The Japanese islands were not a natural resource jackpot. So Japan's empire became the solution. Manchuria was rich in coal and iron. China was huge, full of land, labor, and markets. Southeast Asia had oil and rubber. If Japan could control those regions, Japan would never be dependent on Western powers again. This was the vision sold by nationalist politicians and military officers. And it was dangerously persuasive. Because it didn't sound like conquest. It sounded like self-defense. #3 America's view, the open door and the fear of one empire owning Asia. The United States had its own long-term idea about Asia. It was called the open door policy ***. This wasn't about kindness. It was about business. The U.S. wanted access to Chinese markets. It didn't want Britain or France or Japan controlling China as a closed colony. America didn't necessarily want to rule China. It wanted to sell to China. And Japan's expansion threatened that. So even though the U.S. was still mostly isolationist in the 1930s, American diplomats were worried. Because Japan was not just expanding. Japan was building a system that could lock America out of Asia entirely. #4 The 1930s, a world sliding toward disaster. The scary truth is, Japan wasn't the only country becoming aggressive. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was rising in Germany. In Italy, Mussolini had already built a fascist dictatorship. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was consolidating power brutally. The League of Nations looked weak. The world economy was still unstable. In the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933 and focused on saving America from the Great Depression. Americans did not want war. The memory of World War I was still raw. So the U.S. tried to stay out. But history doesn't care what people want. History cares what happens. #5 Japan goes deeper into China. After taking Manchuria, Japan didn't stop. The Japanese army in China kept pushing. The civilian government in Tokyo sometimes tried to slow things down, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with a broom. Japan's military officers believed expansion was Japan's destiny. They believed compromise was weakness. They believed the West would never truly accept Japan as equal. And they believed China was the key to Japan's future. China at the time was divided and unstable. It was ruled by the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, but it was also fighting internal conflicts, including communist forces led by Mao Zedong. Japan saw opportunity. And then, in 1937, the conflict exploded into full-scale war. #6 The Marco Polo Bridge Incident, the spark that lit China on fire. On July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese forces clashed near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. It began as a small incident. A misunderstanding. A patrol. A gunshot. But in an atmosphere full of tension, small incidents become big wars. Japan used the clash as justification for a massive escalation. Soon, Japan launched major attacks. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. And this was not a quick war. It was a brutal, grinding, expanding conflict that would merge into World War II. #7 The Fall of Shanghai and Nanjing. The war turns dark. Japan attacked Shanghai in 1937. Shanghai was modern and international. Foreigners lived there. Western businesses operated there. Reporters watched the fighting. So unlike earlier conflicts, Americans could see this war more clearly. Photos, newsreels, headlines, and the fighting was savage. Japan eventually captured Shanghai. Then it moved toward the Chinese capital, Nanjing. In December 1937, Japanese forces entered Nanjing. What happened next became one of the most horrifying events of the 20th century. The Nanjing Massacre *, also called the Rape of Nanking. Japanese soldiers killed civilians, executed prisoners, and committed widespread sexual violence. The death toll is still debated by historians, but it was enormous. The horror was undeniable. Foreign observers documented it. Missionaries wrote about it. Diplomats sent reports. Photographs and testimonies spread. In the United States, public opinion began to shift. Japan was no longer seen as simply a rising modern power. Japan was beginning to look like a brutal aggressor. #8 America's moral conflict, isolation versus outrage. Here, where American history gets complicated. Americans were angry about Japan's actions in China. They were sympathetic to Chinese suffering. Many Americans also had strong connections to China through missionaries, education programs, and business. China was often romanticized in American culture. But Americans also did not want war. They didn't want to send troops. They didn't want to fight another overseas conflict. So America was trapped between moral outrage, economic interests, isolationist politics. Roosevelt was personally alarmed by Japan's aggression. But he was constrained. Congress was full of isolationists. The public was not ready. So the U.S. response came in slow steps. And Japan interpreted those steps as hostile. #9 The Panay Incident, when Japan attacked the U.S. before Pearl Harbor. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River in China. This was a huge moment. Japan had directly attacked an American ship. Several Americans were killed. For a moment, it looked like war might come early. But Japan apologized and paid compensation. Roosevelt accepted it. America did not go to war. Japan learned something dangerous. America would tolerate a lot. This encouraged further aggression. #10 Japan's war in China becomes a trap. Japan expected China to collapse quickly. But China did not collapse. Instead, the war dragged on. China was huge. Chinese resistance was stubborn. Japan captured cities, but controlling the countryside was harder. Japan's military became stuck. And the longer the war lasted, the more resources Japan needed. Which meant Japan needed more expansion. This is how empires spiral. They invade to solve a problem. The invasion creates new problems. So they invade more. #11 The Axis Connection. Japan aligns with Germany and Italy. In 1940, Japan signed the *** tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. This formed the core of the Axis alliance. To Americans, this was deeply alarming. Because now Japan wasn't just fighting China. Japan was connected to Hitler. And Hitler was clearly moving toward war in Europe. America began to see global conflict as one connected system. If Germany dominated Europe and Japan dominated Asia, the United States would be boxed in. Roosevelt understood this. Isolationists in America did not. The U.S. was split. #12 The Japanese Vision, Asia for Asians. Japan promoted the idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere ***. This was propaganda, but it was effective. Japan claimed it was liberating Asia from Western colonialism. It claimed it was building a new Asian order. And in some places, that message resonated, especially where European colonial rule had been brutal. But Japan's actions did not match its words. Japanese rule in occupied areas was often harsh. Local populations were exploited. Resources were seized. Resistance was crushed. So Japan's liberation often looked like a new kind of empire. Still, the slogan mattered, because it justified Japan's expansion to its own people. and it framed the coming conflict as a racial and civilizational struggle. Asia versus the West. This framing would make compromise harder. #13 America begins to squeeze, the first sanctions. Roosevelt began applying pressure. At first it was cautious. In 1939, the U.S. ended its commercial treaty with Japan. Then America restricted exports of certain materials, especially aviation fuel and scrap metal. Japan depended on these materials. Japan's military industry needed American supplies. This created a growing crisis in Tokyo. Japan's leaders now faced a terrifying reality. Japan was fighting a major war in China, but America controlled the economic lifeline. Japan could not easily replace U.S. oil. And oil was the bloodstream of modern warfare. No oil equals no navy, no air force, no tanks. #14, 1940–1941, Japan moves into Southeast Asia. As the war in China dragged on, Japan looked south. Southeast Asia was rich in oil, Dutch East Indies, rubber, Malaya, tin, and other resources. But Southeast Asia was mostly controlled by European empires. Britain, France, the Netherlands. Normally, Japan might have hesitated to challenge European colonial powers directly. But Europe was on fire. Germany had conquered France. Britain was fighting for survival. The Netherlands had fallen. Japan saw opportunity. In 1940, Japan moved into French Indochina, modern Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. This was a massive escalation, because it threatened British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. And it put Japan closer to the Philippines, America's territory. America now saw Japan's expansion as an immediate threat. #15 The oil embargo, the decision that made war likely. In 1941, Japan expanded further into Indochina. The United States responded with the most severe economic weapon it had: an oil embargo. The U.S. froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports. This was devastating. Japan imported most of its oil. Without oil, Japan's military would grind to a halt. Japanese leaders calculated they had roughly a year or less of oil reserves. So now Japan faced a choice. And it was the kind of choice that makes history explode. Option A, back down. Withdraw from China. Abandon expansion. Accept U.S. demands. Lose face. Weaken the military's political power. Option B, go to war. Seize oil fields in Southeast Asia. Destroy threats, U.S. Pacific Fleet. Gamble on a quick victory. Force America to negotiate. Japan's leaders debated. But the military increasingly controlled the conversation. Backing down looked like national humiliation. And humiliation in nationalist politics feels worse than death. #16 The diplomatic dance, talks that couldn't work. Throughout 1941, Japan and the United States negotiated. Japan wanted the U.S. to lift sanctions. America wanted Japan to withdraw from China and respect international law. But the gap was enormous. Japan saw withdrawal as surrender. America saw Japan's expansion as unacceptable. The U.S. proposed a framework called the Hull Note, named after Secretary of State Cordell Hull. It demanded withdrawal from China, withdrawal from Indochina, non-aggression agreements, respect for sovereignty. Japan's leaders saw this as an ultimatum. And in a way it was. #17 The Pearl Harbor Plan, a gamble built on speed. Japan's military planners understood something crucial. If Japan attacked Southeast Asia to seize oil, America would likely declare war. And America's Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, was a major threat. Japan believed it could not win a long war against the United States. America's industrial capacity was enormous. Japan's leaders knew this. So why attack? Because they believed they could win the first phase. They believed a sudden surprise attack could cripple U.S. naval power. Japan could seize Southeast Asia quickly. Japan could build a defensive perimeter. America, shocked and discouraged, might negotiate rather than fight for years. This was the gamble. It was not completely irrational. It was based on how wars had ended in the past. Many wars ended when one side lost early momentum. Japan believed America might not have the stomach for a long Pacific War. They misread America, but they did not think they were insane. They thought they were making the only move left. 18, December 7, 1941, the day that changed the world. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. They struck battleships. They struck airfields. They struck ships and sailors. America was stunned. The attack killed thousands. It destroyed much of the U.S. battleship fleet. But it failed to destroy key targets, including aircraft carriers, which were not in port. The next day, Roosevelt gave his famous speech, a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America entered World War II fully. And the Pacific became a battlefield. 19. Why Pearl Harbor was inevitable and why it wasn't. Pearl Harbor often gets treated like it came out of nowhere. Like Japan suddenly went crazy. But if you trace the story from the late 1800s onward, you see a long chain. Japan modernizes to avoid colonization. Japan becomes an empire to secure resources. America expands into the Pacific. Racism and immigration exclusion poison relations. Japan's military grows stronger. China war drags Japan into deeper conflict. America sanctions Japan. Japan runs out of options. Pearl Harbor wasn't an accident. It was the explosion at the end of a fuse lit decades earlier. But it also wasn't inevitable. At multiple points, leaders could have chosen differently. America could have handled immigration and diplomacy with more respect. Japan could have chosen cooperation over conquest. But history is made by humans. And humans are prideful, afraid, ambitious, and often blind. White heavy checkmark end of part 3:4. We have now reached the turning point. Japan and America are at war. And now the story becomes one of the most dramatic, violent, and world-shaping conflicts ever fought across an ocean. America wakes up angry. After Pearl Harbor, the United States didn't just enter the war. It erupted into it. America in late 1941 was a country that had been arguing with itself for years about the Great Depression, about Europe, about isolation, about whether the world's problems were America's business. Pearl Harbor ended that argument overnight. On December 8, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan. The vote was almost unanimous. And suddenly, the U.S. became something it had never been before on this scale. A nation mobilized for total war. Factories that had been making cars started making tanks. Shipyards worked around the clock. Women entered industrial jobs in huge numbers. Young men were drafted. The Pacific Ocean, once a distant space on the map, became a battlefield. And the war that followed would not be clean or quick. It would be brutal, exhausting, and deeply personal. #2 Japan's early victories. The empire explodes across Asia. In the first months of 1942, Japan looked unstoppable. It attacked across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a storm. Japan struck the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. And it did it fast. The reason was simple. Japan had planned this for years. It had trained for it. It had studied Western navies. It had built aircraft carriers and elite pilots. It had prepared the logistics. Japan's goal was to seize resources, especially oil, and build a defensive perimeter so wide that America would struggle to break through. For a moment, it seemed possible. The Philippines, America's first big loss. One of the most painful early defeats for the United States was the fall of the Philippines. The Philippines was an American territory. American and Filipino forces fought hard, but Japan overwhelmed them. By May 1942, the last major resistance collapsed. Thousands of prisoners were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March *, where many died from starvation, abuse, and execution. In America, stories of Bataan spread rage. It became a symbol, not just of defeat, but of cruelty. And it fueled the American desire for revenge. #3 The war turns. Midway and the moment Japan lost its future. Japan's early success was real. But Japan had a problem. It could not replace losses the way America could. The United States had the world's largest industrial base. Japan's economy was strong, but not comparable. Japan's best pilots were elite, but there were fewer of them. America could train more, build more, ship more. So Japan's only chance was to win early and force negotiation. That chance died in June 1942. The Battle of Midway. At Midway, Japan tried to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap. But American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications. The U.S. Navy knew the plan. In a chaotic battle, American dive bombers struck Japan's carriers. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Japan's carrier fleet, its most powerful weapon, was shattered. Midway is often called the turning point of the Pacific War. And that's true. But it was more than a turning point. It was the moment Japan's strategic future collapsed. Japan could still fight. Japan could still kill. Japan could still defend. But Japan could no longer realistically win. From that moment, the war became a slow tightening noose. #4 Island hopping, the war of distance, heat, and blood. The Pacific War was unlike the war in Europe. In Europe, armies fought across connected land. In the Pacific, the battlefield was scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. The war became a campaign of islands. Some islands were tiny specks. Some were jungles. Some were volcanic rock. But each island mattered because it could host an airfield. And airfields meant bombers. Bombers meant the ability to strike the next island. This strategy became known as **island hopping**. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, America would seize key positions, bypass others, cut them off, let them wither on the vine. But even with this strategy, the fighting was savage. #5 Guadalcanal. America learns what this war will cost. The first major offensive was Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed. What followed was months of brutal combat. Jungle fighting, disease, starvation, night attacks, naval battles. Guadalcanal was the first time America saw the nature of the Pacific War clearly. Japan would not surrender easily. Japanese soldiers often fought to the death. They launched desperate charges. They refused to retreat. For Americans, this was shocking, because American military culture assumed that when defeat was clear, the enemy would surrender. Japan's military culture, shaped by nationalism and honor, often treated surrender as shame. This made every battle deadlier, and it shaped the American mindset. If Japan would not surrender, America would have to break it. #6 The home front. Fear, racism, and Japanese-American internment. While Americans fought Japan overseas, something happened at home that remains one of the most painful chapters in U.S. history. After Pearl Harbor, fear spread. On the West Coast, politicians and military officials argued that Japanese Americans might be spies or saboteurs. There was almost no evidence of this. But fear doesn't need evidence. Fear needs an excuse. And racism was already present. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 *. This led to the forced removal of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, from their homes. They were sent to internment camps. Families lost property. Businesses collapsed. Lives were uprooted. The camps were not death camps like those in Nazi Europe, but they were prisons. People were held without trial, without charges, simply because of ancestry. This was a betrayal of American ideals, and it shows something important. War does not only destroy enemies, it also damages the soul of the nations that fight it. #7 The war intensifies. Tarawa Saipan Iwo Jima Okinawa. As America pushed closer to Japan, the battles grew more horrifying. Tarawa, 1943. A tiny island, heavily fortified. Marines landed under machine gun fire. Thousands died in days. Saipan, 1944. A major battle that brought U.S. bombers within range of Japan. Here, civilians jumped from cliffs rather than be captured, terrified by Japanese propaganda about Americans. Iwo Jima, 1945. A volcanic island turned into a fortress. The famous flag-raising photo came from here. But behind that image was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Okinawa, 1945. This was the last major battle before Japan itself. It was a nightmare. Tens of thousands of American casualties, enormous Japanese military losses, and horrific civilian deaths. Kamikaze attacks slammed into U.S. ships. The battle convinced American planners that invading Japan would be catastrophic. #8 Japan under bombs, firestorms over cities. By 1944-1945, American bombers were attacking Japan directly. At first, bombing was limited. But as the U.S. gained airfields and long-range bombers, the campaign became devastating. Japan's cities were vulnerable. Many buildings were made of wood. In March 1945, the U.S. launched a massive firebombing raid on Tokyo. The firestorm killed enormous numbers of civilians. Entire neighborhoods were burned to ash. This was not a surgical war. This was total war. and Japan's leaders still did not surrender. #9 The atomic bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In August 1945, the United States used a weapon the world had never seen. The atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was destroyed. On August 9, 1945, Nagasaki was destroyed. The human suffering was unimaginable. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more died later from burns and radiation sickness. The moral debate over the atomic bomb has never ended. Americans have argued for decades. It ended the war and saved lives by avoiding invasion. It was unnecessary and cruel. Japan was already near collapse. Japan's leadership still refused surrender without shock. All of these arguments have evidence. But the historical fact is this. After the atomic bombs, and after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Japan surrendered. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced surrender to the Japanese people. It was the first time many had ever heard his voice, and it broke the spell of invincibility. #10 The occupation, America remakes Japan. When Japan surrendered, the United States did something unusual. It did not turn Japan into a permanent colony. It occupied Japan. But the occupation's goal was transformation. The leader of the occupation was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur became, in many ways, the most powerful man in Japan. The occupation rewrote Japan's political system. #The emperor stays but changes. America decided not to remove the emperor. Instead, Hirohito remained as a symbolic figure. But the emperor was no longer treated as divine. This was crucial. Removing him might have caused rebellion. Keeping him helped stabilize Japan. #A new constitution. Japan adopted a new constitution in 1947. Its most famous part was Article 9 *, which renounced war as a national right. Japan would not maintain offensive military forces. Japan would focus on peace. This was revolutionary. It reshaped Japan's identity. # War crimes trials. Japanese leaders were tried for war crimes. Some were executed. Others were imprisoned. The trials were controversial, but they were part of the attempt to confront the past. Reforming society. The occupation also expanded women's rights, reformed education, weakened old elites, encouraged labor rights, broke up some major business monopolies. Japan was being rebuilt, not just physically, psychologically. #11 The Cold War. Japan becomes America's key ally. Then the world changed again. Almost immediately after World War II, the Cold War began. America's enemy shifted from Japan to the Soviet Union. Communism spread in Asia. China fell to Mao in 1949. The Korean War erupted in 1950. And suddenly, Japan became strategically priceless. Japan was a stable industrial nation sitting near the Soviet Far East, China and Korea. So America shifted policy. Instead of punishing Japan endlessly, the U.S. decided to rebuild Japan as a strong ally. This is how enemies become partners. Not through love, through necessity. #12 The economic miracle. Japan rises again, this time as a peaceful power. In the 1950s through the 1980s, Japan experienced one of the most dramatic economic growth periods in modern history. Japan became famous for cars, electronics, steel, shipbuilding, precision manufacturing. Companies like Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, and Nissan became global giants. In America, Japan became something new. Not an enemy, not even a military rival, but an economic competitor. In the 1980s, many Americans feared Japan would surpass the U.S. economically. Books and movies portrayed Japan as the new superpower. There were trade tensions. There were political fights. But the relationship was no longer about battleships. It was about factories and markets. And that was a sign of peace. #13 Culture flips the relationship. Anime, games, and a new image of Japan. Here's one of the most fascinating parts of the modern U.S. Japan story. Japan began influencing America not through armies, but through culture. By the late 1900s and early 2000s, Japanese culture became deeply popular in the U.S. Anime, manga, video games, Japanese fashion, Japanese food, Japanese design aesthetics. For younger Americans, Japan was not the enemy from WWII. Japan was Pokémon, Nintendo, Studio Ghibli, Dragon Ball, Final Fantasy, ramen shops, cool technology. And that cultural shift mattered, because cultural affection creates a different kind of alliance. A softer one, a human one. #14 The U.S.-Japan alliance today, built from the ashes of war. Today, Japan and the United States are among the closest allies in the world. The U.S. maintains military bases in Japan. Japan cooperates with America on security, trade, and diplomacy. The alliance is shaped by modern concerns. China's rise, North Korea's missiles, regional security in the Pacific, technology competition, economic interdependence. And yet, the relationship is haunted by history. Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima, Nanjing, internment camps, all of it. But the alliance exists anyway, because history doesn't only create hatred. Sometimes it creates understanding. #15 The Big American Lesson: How Former Enemies Become Partners. If you step back, the U.S. Japan story is one of the strangest transformations in modern history. In less than a century, Japan went from closed feudal state to rising empire, to wartime enemy, to devastated, defeated nation, to democratic ally, to economic competitor, to cultural partner. And America went from forcing Japan open, to fearing Japan's rise, to fighting Japan in total war, to occupying Japan, to rebuilding Japan, to depending on Japan as a strategic partner. It's a relationship forged by conflict, rebuilt by pragmatism, and strengthened by shared interests. A note before we begin. This is a new asterisk telling of the story, written like a vivid popular history book you'd buy at an airport or hear in a top documentary. It's designed to feel cinematic, human, and clear. #1 The silence on the map. For most Americans in the early 1800s, Japan wasn't a place. It was an idea. It was the blank space on the far edge of the world, where the Pacific stretched so wide it felt like it belonged to God, not to nations. The United States was still young, still figuring out what it even was, and the Japanese islands were so distant they might as well have been a myth. But Japan was real, and it had been real for a long time. Japan had mountains and rivers, fishing villages and crowded cities. It had farmers bent over rice fields, merchants counting coins, poets writing about cherry blossoms, and warriors training with swords that were not just weapons but sacred objects. And it had something else. A national decision. A choice made centuries earlier. A choice to close the door. #2 The Rule of the Sword. How Japan Built a World That Could Not Be Entered. Japan's story begins in a place Americans often misunderstand. Because when Americans hear emperor, they imagine a king. When they hear samurai, they imagine romantic warriors. When they hear shogun, they imagine a villain in a movie. But Japan's old political system wasn't a fairy tale. It was a machine built to prevent chaos, a machine built to keep the country from tearing itself apart. And to understand why Japan locked itself away, you have to understand how hard it had been to create peace. The emperor, sacred but distant. At the top of Japan's traditional society stood the emperor. The emperor was not merely a ruler. He was sacred. He was believed to descend from the sun goddess Amaterasu. But for centuries, the emperor did not govern directly. He was a symbol, a spiritual anchor, a living reminder that Japan had a divine origin. Power, in the practical sense, belonged to the men who controlled armies. And those men were the shoguns. The shogun, the real boss. The shogun was the military dictator. If the emperor was the soul of Japan, the shogun was the fist. The shogun controlled the army, the laws, and the lords. Under him were the daimyo, regional rulers who controlled land, wealth, and private armies. Under them were the samurai. The samurai, warriors who were also bureaucrats. The samurai were not just fighters. In the Tokugawa era, many samurai became administrators, tax collectors, and officials. They were the backbone of the system. They lived by Bushido, the warrior code, but their daily life could involve paperwork as much as sword training. Still, the sword mattered, because everyone in Japan understood a truth. Peace in Japan existed because violence had been mastered, organized, and monopolized. And that monopoly belonged to the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa miracle, peace by surveillance. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu won a decisive victory at Sekigahara. It was the kind of victory that doesn't just end a battle, it ends an era. After decades of civil war, Japan finally had a single dominant ruler. Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun. And he did something extraordinary. He created a political system designed to prevent civil war from ever returning. The hidden genius, keep the daimyo broke and watched. Tokugawa rulers knew the daimyo were dangerous. Each daimyo controlled thousands of men. Each daimyo had a castle. Each daimyo had ambitions. So the Tokugawa shogunate created a policy called **Senkin Kata. Every daimyo had to spend alternate years in Edo, Tokyo. And here's the part that made it truly effective. Their families had to remain in Edo all the time. This meant every daimyo's wife and children were, in effect, hostages. Not in chains, not in dungeons, but under watch. The daimyo could rebel, but if he did, his family would die. Also, traveling to Edo with a massive entourage was expensive. Maintaining 2 households was expensive. So Senkin Kata drained daimyo wealth. It made rebellion financially difficult. It was control disguised as tradition. And it worked. For over 250 years, Japan lived in peace. A culture blooms behind walls. In America, people often assume that isolation means stagnation. But Tokugawa Japan was not stagnant. It was alive. Cities grew. Edo became one of the largest cities in the world. Literacy expanded. Art exploded. Kabuki theater flourished. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, captured life in a style that would later inspire European painters. Japan created a culture that was intensely Japanese. It developed its own rhythms, its own rules, its own beauty. It was a society that didn't need the West. And that was the point. Japan was determined not to become another victim of European imperialism. But the Tokugawa leaders didn't just fear conquest. They feared something even more dangerous. Division. #5 The foreign poison. Why Japan feared Christianity. In the 1500s, Europeans arrived in Japan. First Portuguese traders, then Spanish, then Dutch. They brought goods, they brought firearms, and they brought missionaries. Christianity spread quickly in some areas. Some daimyo converted. Churches were built. Communities formed. To a modern American, this might sound harmless. But to the Tokugawa shogunate, Christianity was terrifying. Because it represented loyalty to something outside Japan. A foreign god, a foreign church, a foreign network. And Tokugawa leaders had seen the pattern across the world. Missionaries often came first, then traders, then soldiers, then colonies. Japan looked at the Philippines, taken by Spain, and saw a warning. So Japan cracked down. The hidden Christians. Christians were hunted. Priests were executed. Communities were forced to renounce their faith. Some Christians went underground, becoming Kakure Christians. For generations, they practiced secretly. They disguised Christian symbols as Buddhist ones. They whispered prayers in altered forms. They became a hidden layer of Japanese society, surviving like embers beneath ash. To the Tokugawa rulers, this harshness was necessary. They believed unity was survival. So Japan sealed itself. #6 Sakoku, the country that locked the door. Japan's isolation policy became known as *Sakoku*. It meant closed country. But it wasn't total ignorance. Japan still traded carefully. The Dutch were allowed to trade at Dejima, a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. The Chinese also traded under strict rules. Japan watched the world through a narrow window. And that narrow window was enough. Japan knew Western technology was advancing. Japan knew Europe was expanding. Japan knew America existed. But Japan believed it could manage the outside world by keeping it at arm's length. For a long time it worked. Then steam arrived. And steam changed everything. #7 The Pacific turns into a highway. In the early 1800s, the United States was growing. Growing in land. Growing in population. Growing in ambition. The U.S. was a country that believed in movement. The frontier was not a boundary, it was a direction. Americans pushed west. They reached the Pacific. And once Americans reached the Pacific, the ocean stopped being a wall. It became a road. #The Whaling Empire. American whaling ships roamed the Pacific. Whale oil lit lamps in American cities. It lubricated machines. It fueled industry. But whaling ships were vulnerable. They needed safe ports. They needed food and water. They needed places to repair. And Japan, locked, stable, strategically placed, was perfect. American ships began appearing near Japan. Sometimes they were shipwrecked. Sometimes sailors washed ashore. Japan often treated them harshly. Not always cruelly, but with suspicion. Because Japan's law was clear. Foreigners were dangerous. And Japan's leaders believed one thing above all. If you let the outside world in, it will never leave. #8 The Black Ships, when the ocean brought smoke. In 1853, an American naval officer sailed into Edo Bay. His name was Commodore Matthew Perry, ***. He arrived with warships. Not ordinary ships. Steam-powered ships. Ships that produced black smoke. Ships that looked like floating factories. To the Japanese, These ships were not just foreign. They were unnatural, a symbol of a new age. And Perry was not polite in the way Japan expected. He did not bow. He did not accept being turned away. He did not negotiate like a guest. He behaved like a man delivering a demand. He carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore. It asked Japan to open relations. But Perry's tone made the meaning clear. This is not a request. The Japanese officials were stunned. They had never seen anything like this. The shogunate had spent centuries building walls. Now the wall was being tested by iron and steam. #9 Japan's panic, a government built for yesterday. Inside the Tokugawa government, fear spread. Some leaders wanted to resist. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to delay. But everyone understood the reality. Japan's defenses were outdated. Its coastal cannons were old. Its navy was small. Its military was trained for a different kind of war. The West was armed with industrial power. And industrial power does not care about honor. Industrial power cares about results. Perry left, promising to return. And the Japanese knew he would. When he returned in 1854, he brought more ships, more guns, more pressure. Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. The door cracked open, and once cracked, it could not be closed. #10 The poisoned gift, unequal treaties and humiliation. Soon, other Western powers demanded their own treaties. Britain, Russia, France, the Netherlands. Japan was forced into agreements that limited its sovereignty. Foreigners gained special rights. Tariffs were controlled. Japanese law could be bypassed. Japan had avoided becoming China for centuries. Now it feared it was becoming China in a single decade. This humiliation mattered, because humiliation is not just a feeling. Humiliation is political fuel. It creates extremists. It creates radicals. It creates people who believe compromise is betrayal. And in Japan, a movement began to grow. A movement that would shatter the Tokugawa system. #11 Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians. The slogan was, Sano Joy *, revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians. Young samurai, scholars, and activists blamed the shogunate for weakness. They believed the Tokugawa had lost the right to rule. They believed Japan must restore the emperor and resist foreigners. Some attacked Westerners. Some assassinated officials. Japan's internal peace began to crack. The Tokugawa system, designed to prevent civil war, was now facing something it could not easily control: a national crisis of identity. Japan was being forced to answer a question it had avoided for centuries. What is Japan in a world ruled by empires? #12 The Meiji Restoration, the Old World falls. By the 1860s, the Tokugawa shogunate was collapsing. Two powerful domains, Satsuma and Choshu, led the opposition. They were not democrats. They were not liberals. They were samurai elites who believed Japan must modernize. But they also believed modernization must happen under the emperor's banner. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell. Power was restored to the emperor. A young emperor named Meiji became the symbol of a new Japan. This was the Meiji Restoration *. And it was one of the most dramatic revolutions in modern history. Because Japan did something no other non-Western nation had done successfully. It decided to modernize on purpose. Not because it was conquered, not because it was colonized, but because it chose survival. #13 The samurai become ghosts. Modernization sounds exciting, but it was brutal. The Meiji leaders dismantled the old system. They centralized power. They created a national army. They abolished samurai privileges. They modernized taxes. They modernized education. They modernized industry. For the samurai, this was the end of their world. Some adapted. Some became officials. Some became businessmen. Some became teachers. But many felt betrayed. The sword, once the symbol of the nation's backbone, was now an artifact. And artifacts do not feed families. The samurai class began to collapse. The old Japan was dying. And a new Japan was being born. #14 America watches, admiration mixed with unease. From the American point of view, Japan's transformation was almost unbelievable. Imagine a country that still had castles, swords, and feudal lords in 1850. Then imagine that same country building railroads, factories, modern armies, and warships by 1890. That's what Japan did. It was like watching someone sprint through centuries. Americans admired it, but they also feared it. Because a modern Japan meant a powerful Japan. And a powerful Japan meant America had a rival in the Pacific. The story of the next century would be shaped by that rivalry. #15 The cliffhanger. Japan chooses the sword again. At the end of Part 1, Japan stands at the edge of a new era. The old feudal system is collapsing. The emperor is rising as a national symbol. The country is modernizing rapidly. But modernization is not neutral. It is not peaceful by default. Modernization is power. And power creates ambition. Japan has learned the West's lesson. In the modern world, you are either strong or you are owned. Japan will not be owned. So Japan will become strong. And soon, Japan will do what strong nations do. It will expand. It will fight. And it will demand a place among empires. The Meiji miracle accelerates. By the 1870s, Japan was no longer the country of samurai and castles that America or Europe might have imagined. It was an asterisk machine of modernization asterisk. Railroads stretched across islands. Telegraph lines connected towns. Factories churned out textiles, steel, and guns. Education was mandatory. Citizens were being trained for a modern world. Military conscription created a large national army, no longer only samurai, but every able-bodied man. Western advisors were hired. German officers trained the army. British officers taught the navy. French engineers built industry. Japan was not imitating the West blindly. It was asterisk absorbing knowledge and turning it into its own weapon asterisk. #2 Japan's first imperial adventures, Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands. With modernization came ambition. Japan's first step outside its borders was China. It was asterisk Taiwan, Formosa. In 1874, a small incident involving Ryukyuan sailors led Japan to claim intervention in Taiwan. It was framed as protecting its people, but was really a test of asterisk Japan's ability to project power overseas. The Qing Empire of China protested. But Japan, now confident and modern, pushed forward. This small campaign was a learning experience. How to move troops overseas. How to supply them. How to negotiate with Western powers watching. Japan was discovering the mechanics of empire. #3 The War with China, 1894–1895. The first real test of Japan's imperial strength came with the First Sino-Japanese War ***. China had long been the regional giant. Japan had been a tiny island nation, closed off. But by the 1890s, the balance had shifted. Japan clashed with China over Korea a land both nations saw as strategically vital. The war was a shock for the world. Japan won decisive naval victories. Its army moved fast and effectively. Western observers were stunned. China was humiliated. Japan gained Taiwan as a colony. It secured influence over Korea. The war showed something powerful. Japan could compete with a traditional Asian superpower and win. #4 Russia steps in, the road to another test. By 1900, Japan's rise was impossible to ignore. Russia, expanding eastward, had interests in Manchuria and Korea. Conflict seemed inevitable. America, watching from the Pacific, noticed a new reality. Japan could fight modern wars. Japan could challenge Western powers in Asia. The United States itself would eventually have to reckon with Japan. Tensions grew quietly, diplomats scrambled. Then war arrived. #5 The Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905. In 1904, Japan launched a *** preemptive strike on Russian forces at Port Arthur ***. It was a surprise attack, echoing what America would see decades later at Pearl Harbor. The war was brutal. Japan's navy destroyed Russian fleets. Land battles were vicious and bloody. Logistics and technology were tested to the limit. The outcome shocked the world. An Asian nation defeated a European empire in modern warfare. Western nations, including the United States, were forced to recognize Japan as a ** serious military power **. The U.S., under President Theodore Roosevelt ** mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Japan won territory and international recognition, but also a sense of pride and destiny. #6 America and Japan, curiosity turns to rivalry. By 1905, Americans were fascinated and anxious. Japan's modernization had been rapid, complete, and effective. Americans recognized Japan could now build a modern navy, train a disciplined army, compete with Europe and the U.S. for influence. At the same time, racial prejudice fueled unease. Many Americans could not imagine Japan as an equal. Japanese immigrants in California were facing discrimination. The Yellow Peril narrative emerged, a growing fear of a rising Japan that could threaten American interests in the Pacific. America admired Japan, but didn't entirely trust its *. #7 Korea, annexation and empire building. In 1910, Japan annexed * Korea, officially turning it into a colony. This was a major moment in Japan's transformation. Japan now had overseas territory on the continent. It had an industrial base in Korea to support its ambitions. Its military and bureaucracy were fully capable of controlling foreign populations. Koreans resisted fiercely, but Japan suppressed uprisings brutally. The annexation marked the full emergence of Japan as an empire ***, a nation that would no longer stay confined to its islands. #8 Japan in world affairs, allies and observers. Japan's victories earned attention worldwide. During World War ***, Japan joined the Allies. It seized German possessions in the Pacific and China. But Japan's expansion raised eyebrows. America was wary of Japanese influence in Asia. Britain welcomed Japan as a counterbalance to Germany in Asia, but feared long-term consequences. China viewed Japan increasingly as a threat. Japan was learning the rules of modern empire. * win wars, expand territory, gain recognition, and always project strength. #9 Domestic tensions, democracy, militarism, and national pride. Inside Japan, Modernization brought tension. Political parties emerged, but the military retained real power. The population was educated, but traditions remained strong. National pride surged, fueled by victories abroad. By the 1920s, Japan was balancing modern democracy with old militarism, a duality that would later become central to its decisions in the 1930s and 1940s. Americans watching saw a rising industrial and naval power, a nation eager for recognition, a country whose pride might lead to conflict. #10 The seeds of tension, America and Japan in the Pacific. By the 1920s, the U.S. had its own Pacific interests, including the Philippines and Hawaii. Japan had won respect, but also fear from the West. Immigration issues in the U.S. heightened tensions. Naval arms races began. Treaties attempted to limit conflict. The stage was being set. Two Pacific powers, increasingly aware of each other, increasingly mistrustful. Economic ambitions overlapping. Cultural misunderstandings deepening. The story of Japan and America was no longer theoretical. It was approaching reality, an inevitable collision in the Pacific.